Prologue.
"I hate this place, master," Keiren said as she leaned closer to the enormous fireplace, trying desperately to warm herself. The fire had been roaring for some time, but the flames barely penetrated the chill in her skin. Keiren and her mentor, Master Adnan, had been stationed for 5 days at a remote temple in the middle of nowhere. At least, nowhere in the kingdom of Brea that Keiren cared about. It had been raining for a better part of the night, and a now soaking Keiren was huddled by the fire, wrapped tightly in several blankets to get warm. While she had been out keeping watch, her master had gotten to sit inside, where there was a fire and no torrential rain to soak her. "A junta warrior does not complain, nor rebuke her orders," Master Adnan chided. Somehow, the master was not cold, despite the fact that she wore light clothing and sat near the window. She casually read a huge tome with the title Records of Battles During the Reign of Emperor Sarnik, Age of Mountains. Unfortunately, that was about as interesting as the books got here. The temple was ancient, dedicated to Dolan, the god of the lost, the space between reality and dreams, or forgotten things. It was fitting for this temple, crumbling and abandoned to memory, to be the house of the feared god. What secrets lay in its depths? Keiren wished to explore more, but she had been ordered to stay within the entrance hall or the grounds outside.
"I'm sorry, master, but I don't understand how I'm meant to do my duty if I don't know what my duty is,"
Keiren said through her shivers. The carved stone of the temple was frigid against her body where she sat upon the floor. Master Adnan finally looked up from her book and turned her amber eyes to Keiren. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and at first Keiren thought her master of 5 years was angry at her. After all, Keiren always had a lot of questions, and that was probably why they had been shipped off to nowhere. But underneath Master Adnan's stern demeanor were misgivings in her eyes, or perhaps doubt. "Have you heard of the 5 original masters?" Master Adnan asked. Keiren fought to keep herself from rolling her eyes.
"Yes, of course, master. When I first joined the Sekran, they were all the children of Sarel,"
she said, just as she had many times before when learning the history and scripture of the junta. "Not just the children of Sarel, but the founders of the junta order," Master Adnan corrected. "Jeseni, a master of light, Isana, a master of fire, Sorn, a master of water, Kalamet, a master of earth, and Jantikar, a master of—"
"Night! I know, master. I didn't forget everything from the Sekran,"
Keiren said. Master Adnan sighed. "We all learn this as the foundation of our order. The original masters received their power from Sarel, who was blessed by Jos."
"And all junta are connected to Sarel's line,"
Keiren added. "Yes, but Keiren, that is not all. What is the highest duty of the junta?"
"To protect the temple of the gods,"
Keiren answered automatically. This response was drilled into her and every other junta the moment they were accepted into the Sekran. "Yes, but why?"
"Because if the temples are destroyed, or there are no junta to protect them, they will be desecrated by those who do not worship, and the gods will favor us no longer,"
Keiren said. "If that is true, why are some temples abandoned, like this one?" Master Adnan asked. Keiren paused. She had always assumed that some temples would be left to crumble, but new ones would take their place to continue the duty of worship. Master Adnan noticed Keiren's hesitation and said, "All temples are sacred. Some are protected not by junta warriors, but by something else. Something not many junta know of. And the ones who do are certain it's more valuable than any temple." There was a pregnant silence before Keiren said,
"Well, what is it?"
Master Adnan hesitated to answer. Usually she tolerated Keiren's endless inquiry, so the pause was a little unsettling for the young junta. What was so important that it lay wasted in an abandoned temple with no one daring to speak of it? Her master sighed and returned to her book. "There are some things that you would not wish to know. A powerful secret can be a dangerous one," Master Adnan finally said, her voice weary. Keiren grunted in acknowledgement and stared into the fire. Another tidbit of information that she wouldn't get to know until she became a master, and that was still years away. She took the poker and jabbed it into the fire, sending small embers flying out of the fireplace. She was 19 years old, and still she couldn't know the reason behind her assignments. "Shall I make some tea?" Keiren asked once she finished assaulting the fire, but Master Adnan didn't answer. She turned around to ask again, but found her master staring out the window. Through the rain, her eyes narrowed. "What is it, Master Adnan?" Keiren asked quietly. "Someone is coming." Master Adnan cautiously got her sword from beside her chair and walked up to the door, listening and waiting. Keiren followed suit, except she got her bow and quiver and stood farther back in the room, pulling an arrow from her quiver for whoever approached. Although Keiren doubted anyone more dangerous than a monk was coming, she knew Master Adnan's skill well enough to trust her instincts. Only the sound of rain pattering outside filled the air as the two women waited for the other person in the forested wilderness. Without warning, the blade of an axe pierced the wooden door with a sharp thud, only a hair's breadth from Master Adnan's face. She lurched back, and instead of standing at the ready like Keiren expected, she turned and started running for the main hall of the temple. "Keiren!" Her gut twisted in shock and fear. She slung her bow and quiver over her back and sprinted after her master into the temple. Several more fires glowed within, making shadows dance on the walls and robed, faceless statues. The door crashed just then, not too far behind them. Master Adnan ran to the very back of the temple, where the largest statue of Dolan sat, his face shadowed by a cowl. She rushed to the base of the statue, feeling for something where Dolan's feet peeked out from the carved folds of robes. After a moment, something clicked, and to Keiren's amazement, the stone at the base of Dolan's feet began to move slowly. Master Adnan urged Keiren to duck under the small entry into utter darkness. The darkness did not last long. With a wave of her hand, Master Adnan summoned a small ball of light in her palm. She held it out in front of her as the underground chamber doors closed. The light of it reflected eerily off the pair, turning Master Adnan's blonde hair almost white and Keiren's chestnut hair gold. Footsteps echoed in the hall behind them. "Keep moving," Master Adnan prodded, as Keiren still stood in awe of the secret chamber before them. It was a long, dark hallway lined with ragged stone. Whoever had carved it out cared more about practicality than aesthetics, for the ceiling was low and apt to scrape one's head if one wasn't slouching. Rusted sconces lined the walls, likely to provide light no more.
"Master Adnan, where are we going? Who is coming after us?"
Keiren hissed as they shuffled through the narrow passageway. "They call themselves Sabal," Master Adnan replied. In the glow of the small light in her hand, her normally bright eyes were dim and narrowed. "Something is hidden here, something powerful that they want. That is all I know." Their pursuers forced the passage door open. The rumble shook the walls, and light spilled in from the great hall of the temple. Pounding footsteps charged into the tunnel. Keiren's mind raced faster than her pulse. Protect her master. Protect herself. She called upon the water from the small pouch sitting on her hip. Her face tightened with concentration as she shot one fast-spinning ball of water at their pursuers. Grunts and the stumble of bodies pierced through the dark of the passage. Keiren could only hope that meant she had hit them with enough force to knock them back or blind them temporarily. Keiren and Master Adnan hurried out of sight for a moment as the passage curved to the right. They pressed forward quietly as possible in the cramped space, knowing not what awaited them up ahead. A sound whizzed behind Keren, and then came a loud chink on the stone. Keren looked back for a moment in the near darkness. A glint of metal revealed a dagger on the floor, sharp and painful looking. Thankfully, whoever threw it was not as good a shot as Keren. She couldn't help but grin in satisfaction. "I see something," Master Adnan whispered as they rounded another corner, though nothing lay in the darkness ahead. That was a talent unique to the Light Warriors, who could see much more in the dark than any other junta. Keren looked back again. Their pursuers were far enough behind to not see them, but close enough to bounce shadows from their own lights off the curve of the passage. As she turned forward, she nearly ran into Master Adnan, who had stopped. In the glow of the light, a faint outline of a door marked the end of the passage. At least, Keren assumed it was the end. Hoped it was the end. A strange circle covered in grooves marked the door. Keren wrinkled her eyebrows as she studied it. "It's a..." her master interjected, and Keren fell silent. Master Adnan quickly searched for a handle, but there seemed to be none. She wound up her leg and gave the door a hard kick, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps, rough voices, and bobbing lights were getting closer. "Think, Adnan, think!" Master Adnan hissed. Keren had never seen her this scared before, and that frightened her more than the immediate danger behind them. "What does this symbol mean?" Keren whispered, hoping it was the key to their entrance. Master Adnan closed her eyes for a moment and pressed her fist to her forehead. Keren's own panic surged at her master's loss of composure. "I will hold them off." "Wait," Master Adnan said. She put her palm on the door and let the light in her palm melt into it. The light split into 100 different lines, which traced carvings in the door that were strange and foreign to Keren. The light disappeared from the door. The strangers were almost upon them. Keren braced herself for another flying dagger. She summoned more water from her pouch and spread it as much as possible before her chest and head, then froze the water. The thin ice shield would not protect them from much, but it would at least slow something down. Suddenly, the door started sliding open and retreating into the wall. Master Adnan and Keren rushed inside, and Master Adnan pressed her palm against the stone to close the door again, but it didn't answer. Her eyes flashed to Keren, wide and desperate. "Go, Keren. I will hold them off at the door." "But..." Keren started to argue. "Go!" Master Adnan shouted. Keren tore herself away from her master and kept running. "Master Adnan is powerful," she told herself. "She can protect herself and me." She refused to let the seeds of doubt take root and poison her resolve. The master's light only penetrated a little ways into the chamber, and Keren had to slow down and feel in front of her. The hair on the back of Keren's neck prickled as static charge filled the air. She did not look back but knew what was going to happen. The room filled with a flash of light, which illuminated the new chamber they had entered moments ago. It was not large, but it was bigger than the cramped passageway Keren and her master had crouched their way through. A crack followed the bright flash, and a man screamed. Keren still refused to look back. She did not want to ruin the hope and confidence she had in her master. She fumbled to the other side of the room until she hit a wall. Crack! There was another flash. In that moment, an altar of sorts appeared, with a pedestal in the middle. Something small glinted on the pedestal. Then the room went dark again. Keren looked over her shoulder for Master Adnan. She swept her arm behind her back to grab her bow and arrow from the quiver. She drew the arrow and held it there, waiting for an opportunity to shoot. She could not directly see her master, but she did see flashes of light that illuminated the outline of her master and their pursuers. Keren counted 2. One held a sword out in front of him, as if it would keep the lightning at bay. The other was moving to try to flank Master Adnan. If Keren could see just one more flash. A blaze of light bathed the whole room in white light. Master Adnan had caged herself in a shield of energy, her eyes glowing white. Kaden aimed her shot at the man with the long sword and fired. He fell down in a heap, an arrow protruding from his chest. However, the other man raised his 2 daggers as he got within range.
"Master, behind you!"
Kaden shouted over the crackle of the lightning. But it was too late. A dark stain bloomed on the front of Master Adnan's shirt, and the glint of the metal dagger flashed in the light where it stuck out of her chest. Kaden lined up her shot, sucked in her breath, and eyed her target. Strangely, she was calm. The tears would come later. She released the arrow as the light dimmed and struck the other adversary through the eye. He crumpled instantly. Kaden sprinted to her master, knelt beside her, and gathered her in her arms. Master Adnan's eyes had lost their glow, but she was still able to maintain the soft light on her hands. She looked at Kaden with a strange expression.
"Kaden,"
she gasped.
"Master, I will get you out of here. We will get to Detma before sunrise,"
Kaden said, believing that if she said it with enough conviction, it would become true.
"No, Kaden. The amulet. You must. It..."
A violent coughing fit struck Master Adnan, and blood trickled down her chin.
"Whatever it is, we will get it. Together,"
Kaden assured her, for once being the calm and contained half of the pair. Master Adnan shook her head unevenly as her body convulsed for breath.
"It must be protected at all costs,"
she managed to get out. Kaden fought with all her will against the tears threatening to spill. She had to be strong for her master and get her to safety. But in the bottom of Kaden's heart, she knew it wasn't going to happen.
"I will keep it safe,"
Kaden whispered through her tears.
"Kaden, I am proud of you,"
Master Adnan said, a slight smile on her lips. The light in her master's hands faded, returning her to complete darkness. She set her master's body down gently. Gradually, she gathered her composure and steeled herself. Master Adnan would not want her to linger on grief. She felt around her master's waist until she found the buckle of her scabbard. Her fingers trembled as she unbuckled it and pulled it from under her master's body. She put it around her own waist. The sword felt necessary. If anything, it would be needed for Master Adnan's funeral, since Kaden did not have the strength to carry her body all the way to Detma. Feeling numb, she retreated from the carnage, reaching for the altar she had seen earlier. She felt the edge of the altar and found her way to the pedestal that held the strange artifact. It was small, cylindrical, and strung onto a simple cord. Kaden could feel small etches in the cold metal surface. When she touched it, she felt a slight tingling in her fingers, as if the amulet harnessed an energy of some kind. "You feel pain." Kaden was so startled that she dropped the cylinder. She swiftly nocked an arrow and drew her bow. She whipped her body back and forth, listening for whoever spoke. There was nothing, only the blackness of the room and utter silence. The bodies on the floor remained quiet. She slowly turned in the direction she had dropped the artifact. Cautiously, she lowered her bow and put the arrow back in her quiver. On her hands and knees, she felt around the floor for it. Could it be? Nothing else was there that could have talked to her. Her hands found the small, solid form of the strange artifact. "I sense you are in great danger." Kaden realized that the voice was not coming from around her. It was within her, in her mind. But it sounded like someone was right next to her, talking as though they weren't in an underground secret chamber full of corpses. The thought of her master's dead body lying amongst the others sent a fresh wave of grief through her, and she shivered. "You mourn for her." Kaden spoke aloud.
"Who are you?"
There was a moment of silence, and she thought the voice was gone.
"I want to help you, but you must move quickly."
Kaden could not see it in the darkness, but she stared at the blackness surrounding her hands. This was impossible. A small piece of metal could not talk to a person, especially through their mind. She was going crazy. Her master's death had caused something to break in her head.
You are not insane. I am indeed real. You need to go before the others come.
Keiran collected herself. If there was going to be a voice in her head trying to help her, she might as well accept it, real or not. Reaching her hands out to feel in front of her, she began to search the room for a way out. The only exit she could find was the way she came in, but if there were others, as the voice said, they could be lying in wait for her. She fumbled her way to the back wall and ran her fingers over the coarse stone. Her fingers touched a groove in the stone, the outline of a door. She pushed with all her might. After a few moments of effort, the wall began to budge. With one last push, the door was open enough for her to squeeze through. She closed it again in case anyone would follow them into the tunnel. She put the cylinder in a pouch on her belt, and she felt a subtle shift in her mind that she somehow knew meant her connection to the voice was lost. She pushed through thick overgrowth of vines and bramble, scratching at her and clinging to her hair and clothes. Once outside, she saw that she was behind the temple, coming up from underground. A set of moss-covered stairs took her up to ground level. It had stopped raining at last. The moon shone brightly through the thin clouds, much to Keiran's dismay. Normally, she would give anything to have clear skies to see the moons, Atima and Patal, looking down at her. Now, the light would expose every action she took. She snuck to the trees, trying to duck behind thick, knotted trunks before anyone noticed her. A shout came from atop the temple. Keiran sprinted at top speed, zigzagging through the forest. Her boots sank unevenly into the mud, and more than once she slipped. For a moment, the only sound was her ragged breath heavy with exertion and fear. Then she heard not-so-distant calls for more men to pursue. Soon after, she heard the thump-thump of hooves hitting the damp forest floor. She pushed herself to go faster. A streak whipped past her and landed somewhere in the distance. She didn't have much time before she risked getting shot. Hundreds of ideas were racing through her head, and she tried to calculate which would be the most likely to help her survive. A deadly whistling sound came from behind. She swerved her body to the right to avoid its path, but it was too late. The arrow was too close, and the archer was too precisely on his mark. Fire savagely pierced Keiran's left shoulder, and in the shock of the agony, she tumbled onto the hard ground. Rocks and branches slammed into her, pounding into her ribs and scraping her arms. With each blow, Keiran grunted in pain until she finally came to rest against a thick tree trunk. Keiran still had enough sense about her to get up and take cover out of the path of the men chasing her, though the fight to keep her thoughts clear was increasingly becoming a losing battle. Somehow in her tumble, she had lost her bow. There was no time to recover it. Not that she was in any shape to use it anyway. Not daring to look at the arrow protruding from her shoulder, Keiran stumbled deeper into the trees. The wound had started to throb, getting more painful with each beat of her heart. The thunder of her assailant's horse's hooves slowed to a pause. The pursuer was silent, no doubt listening for any sign of her movement. Keiran struggled to stay still, but her strength was depleted, and her knees gave out under her. Her hunter dismounted and came toward where Keiran was lying helplessly. Using every bit of strength she could muster out of her weakened body, she forced herself to stand and hide behind the trunk of a thick tree. The man stalked his prey, not saying a word. Keiran hardly dared to breathe. Haziness began to dominate her vision, and she could feel the black of unconsciousness edging into her mind. Stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. The hunter became too silent to hear, and Keiran was too afraid to peer around the edge of the tree trunk to determine his position. She held her breath, concentrating all her focus on hearing any sign of him. A hand lunged around the trunk, grabbed Keiran's left arm, her impaled arm, and brutally twisted it. The pulse of pain that throbbed through Keiran nearly finished her. She gave a strangled cry.
"You will give the Sem-Kalad to me,"
he demanded from behind her. His voice was rough and heavy, like a slab of stone being dragged across gravel.
"I don't know what you're talking about,"
Keren gasped. Talking with her wounded ribs hurt even more than her arm. He twisted her arm harder, intensifying the sharp stabs of pain and eliciting another cry from her.
"Stupid woman,"
he seethed. With his other hand, he pulled her hair until her neck bent backward, forcing her to look at his face.
"Give it to me, or you will die. The serpent will feast upon your pretty little face tonight."
His breath smelled rotten, as if a rat had crawled into his mouth and died. His face reflected the unpleasantness of his breath. A huge scar ran across his face from his left temple to his nose, and stubble created a dark shadow on the lower half of his visage.
"Kill me then,"
Keren mustered out.
"Oh, no, no, no. The taste of your death will be for her."
His wide smile revealed a mouthful of misshapen and crooked teeth. Keren grimaced. Another man's call suddenly stabbed the still night air, and for a moment the hunter looked up. A moment was all Keren needed. Her free right hand grabbed the hilt of Adnan's sword and drew it, slashing it across the man's chest. His vice-like grip immediately loosened as his hands flew up to protect himself. With renewed energy, Keren scrambled up and out of her pursuer's reach. The pressure on her ribs nearly made her lose consciousness, but she managed to stay upright. She held Master Adnan's sword in the midguard position. "Have you got her?" the voice called out, its owner stepping beside Keren's hunter.
"Until you made me let her go, Bolach. But no matter. Death eagerly awaits her,"
he said, standing up to full height. Keren tried to see what advantages her surroundings held, but there were none. Towering trees around them taunted Keren with false protection. She was alone, with an arrow in her shoulder, and now about to die. She took the sword and pointed it at them, trying to feign more strength than she had. Blackness was once again seeping into her vision, threatening to dominate all she saw.
"Look how she uses her toy,"
the newcomer cackled. Keren merely gave them a steely glare. The two men started to stride closer, confident in capturing their quarry. Keren was cornered. With only a sword, she would not last long. They would overpower her easily. She would fail Master Adnan, who lay dead in the secret depths of the temple. She would fail her family. She would fail Brea. And all for the small object tucked in her pouch. The amulet. It was her last chance. She did not know what it would do, but she had to try. She reached inside her tunic and pulled the insignificant-looking object from its pouch. With hesitation, she stared wide-eyed at it. Then she focused all her thoughts on one word: escape.
"There is a way. You will suffer, and you will experience a loneliness few have ever known. But you and the Sem-Kalad will be safe."
Only a moment passed, but it seemed so much longer. Such was the speed of the voice in her head. Keren gritted her teeth and thought,
"Do it then."
The two men looked at each other with panic and lunged for her. But it was too late. Keren's body felt as if it were being ripped apart. Reality blurred and shifted into nothing and everything at once. No light, no dark. There just was. She closed what she thought were her eyes, unable to fight against the mounting possibility that she would not survive this. What first struck her was the smell. It was stringent, unnatural, an unwelcoming smell. She was together again, lying on a cold, hard surface. It was silent. Keren dared not open her eyes, in fear of what she would see. Whatever she was lying on was frigid compared to the warm ground in the forest. It was rough and poked into her ribs painfully. She opened her eyes. They would not focus for a few moments, and all she could see were blurry shapes of varying shades of gray. It was dark enough to be night, and Kaden hoped it wasn't supposed to be daytime in this place. She wanted a sun to warm her. Slowly, the hazy shapes became more distinct. They were nothing Kaden had ever seen before. They were blocks of stone as far as she could tell, with no function whatsoever except to stand there. She moved her head to see around her. It was roughly the same. A giant circle of stones surrounded her. Instead of trying to get up, Kaden conceded to try to roll over onto her side. The smell wasn't only on the stone, it was in the air as well. She grimaced as her ribs and shoulders screamed in protest at her change of position. She looked at her arm, now that she had the opportunity. The head of the arrow protruded from the front of her shoulder like a bloody wooden snake. Most of it was behind her shoulder, where she couldn't see well. That, added to the dozens of scratches and scrapes she had attained while clambering through the trees, surely gave her the appearance of the angry demons her grandmother used to warn her about. The amulet was still in her hand. However, the voice was silent. Kaden could not tell if the voice had lost the connection or if it had simply completed its task. Kaden attempted to push herself up, but collapsed under her own weight. Pain pulsed through her ribs again, knocking the air from her. Tiny bright lights popped in and out of her vision. She wanted to see the sky, to know she was still real. With great effort, she rolled over and gazed up to the stars, hoping for the familiarity of the night sky. A bright light shone in the sky, illuminating the treetops and creating deep shadows underneath. For a moment, Kaden thought she saw the 2 moons of Brea, but when her vision slid back into focus, she saw only one large moon with dark and light patches. Kaden was truly somewhere else, a completely different realm from Brea. After what seemed like forever, Kaden felt clear-headed enough to try to get up. With nearly all the strength she had left, she heaved her body upright. Slowly, painstakingly, she took a step forward, then another. Her feet found grass, or what she assumed was grass. It felt the same as on the plains of Brea, sure enough, but this grass seemed tougher, more resilient against her boots. Kaden looked to the sky again to see the lonely disk showing her the way to the forest. She stumbled her way to the trees. Much time passed as Kaden tried to navigate. She did not know what to look for, or if she even wanted to look for something. The trees were a source of familiarity, a reminder of the great forests that covered the land of her home. Though she struggled to push the thought from her mind, she wondered more than once whether she would ever return. Was this her home now?
The price of protecting Brea is to abandon it.
Though Kaden had been trained all her life in the art of stealth, her exhausted legs and aching body made her stumble, each foot landing heavily in front of the other. More than once she almost fell over, only to clutch onto a tree. Each time she did, pain exploded out of her shoulder and into bright lights on the edge of her vision. When Kaden thought she could no longer go on, she heard a small, rhythmic sound. She started toward it, guided by an irrational hope that it would lead her home. Upon closer approach, she could tell the sound was the chink of metal on wood, a slow and heavy rhythm. With each blow, a deep grunt accompanied it.
Gedmet,
was Kaden's immediate thought, the god of forest, field, and labor.
I have found the realm of the gods,
she mused. Her grandmother was wrong. The gods did not live under the Brenya Sea in the watery halls of Palmen, but instead on the dry land of an entirely other realm. Or perhaps she had died, bleeding to death as the hunter slid his sword between her ribs, and this was some vision of her joining the gods.
I always imagined meeting Svara, not Gedmet. How strange,
she thought as the world became a little hazier. The chinks and clunks grew louder with each step, and by now Kaden could see a golden glow among the trees, constantly shifting the shadows.
Lera, Even she is here in this world of night.
But the goddess of fire was always at odds with the god of the forest, as her grandmother had always said. Perhaps she was as wrong about this as she was about the stories of Palmen under the sea. Keren was close enough now that she could hear the ragged breath of Gedmet between each swing, as well as the soft whispers of Lera as her shadows danced among the trees. She was surprised neither god nor goddess heard her loud steps as her boots cracked twigs and her hands rustled branches. The clinking stopped. A deep voice called out in a language Keren did not understand.
The voice of Gedmet.
Keren did not know how to reply. How does one speak to a god, except with the sound of knees falling upon the ground? Using a thin tree as support, Keren peered around it to finally lay eyes on her gods. But there were no gods. There was only a man and his fire. He held an axe, just like Gedmet, but he was short and had no beard. Instead, 2 rectangular discs rimmed his eyes. He wore strange clothes that Keren had never seen the likes of, not the fabled indestructible armor of Gedmet. Lera was simply a fire, and small at that, crackling in the middle of a small clearing. Keren did not know what to make of him. She felt weaker than ever. Her strength disappeared along with the hope of seeing Gedmet and Lera, the hope of being able to return home. The fiery pain in her shoulder had been reduced to embers that spread down her arm and into her neck. She sank to her knees, darkness threatening to envelop the entire world. Dropping his axe, the man began to run toward her, shouting more unintelligible words, his hands reaching out to her broken body. But that did not prevent Keren Galma from fainting, and she welcomed the darkness where she knew no more. John Strauss at first thought it was some kind of prank. A small noise came from behind the tree to his left. His head swiveled in the direction of the noise, his axe held tightly in his hand. "Jimmy, is that you?" There was no answer. He looked around for any sign of his friend, who was supposed to be bringing more firewood. But then, only seconds later, a bloodied hand reached around the tree. Though he was 20 years old, John thought it was a monster. But then he thought it was someone in a bloody zombie costume intending to scare the bejesus out of him. It was only when he saw the figure sink to the ground that he realized it was a severely injured woman. "What the?" he exclaimed as she fell, hitting her head on the tree trunk. He hurried to her side and was halted by the sheer sight of her. She was wearing the strangest clothes he had ever seen, like she had stepped right out of Xena, Warrior Princess. They were brown and made of material that reminded him of burlap. Her left sleeve was covered in blood, and the arrow protruding from her shoulder was quite real. Her hands were covered in blood as well, as though she had put them under a running blood faucet. Leaves and twigs poked out from random places in her braided hair and on her clothes. The sword in her hand elicited a stronger expletive from John. It, amazingly, was the only thing that was not smeared in blood. John was petrified. Where had she come from? Why was she wandering around the woods at this time of night? And more importantly, why was she covered in blood? Thinking about the blood moved him into action. She could be dying, and all he was doing was standing there like an idiot. He knelt at her side and checked for a pulse. It was there, fast and rather weak, but it was there. His own heart still raced, but he felt relieved. He lifted an eyelid, and a stunning gray eye stared blankly, the pupil shrinking in the light of the fire. Aside from the blood and dirt, he noticed that she had a very elegant and beautiful face. But that was not important right now. He had to get her to a hospital immediately. For a moment longer he could only stare at her in indecision as he contemplated the consequences of hauling an unconscious woman covered in blood into the hospital. Perhaps she had gotten drunk at a costume party somewhere nearby and happened to fall down a few times while making her way to his campground. But that sounded utterly ridiculous, even to him. Either way, here was a beautiful, bloodied woman, and he had no way to explain it. He felt along her sides, looking for pockets or any sign of where she could have come from, but there was absolutely nothing on her to indicate her identity. The only thing he could find was a small object clutched in her other hand. It was a strange thing, small and cylindrical, and with strange markings etched around it. It looked like it was ancient and worn with age. What on earth is this for? John took it and tucked it into his pocket. With no help, John found it difficult to lift the woman off the ground. Even though he considered himself fairly athletic, the woman had enough muscle to, firstly, defeat him in every sporting event imaginable, and secondly, weigh her down considerably. He moved her gently, not even wanting to ponder the possibility of internal injuries. He needed to get Jimmy's help in order to get her to safety, but Jimmy was off searching the grounds for enough firewood to last the night. So John was left to awkwardly grab the woman by the armpits and drag her to the truck he and Jimmy had driven out to the campground. He feared he was doing more damage, but he couldn't just leave her there. After a few minutes of lugging the woman's limp body, John was huffing like a winded bull. "John? Jesus, man, what are you doing?" Jimmy's voice came suddenly, his footsteps concealed by the breathless exertion of John moving the woman's body. The darkness could not hide the incredulity on Jimmy's face as he took in the strange scene. "I found her. She found me, actually. Help me. She's hurt," John panted. Jimmy stared at her, unable to process what he was seeing. "Is that an arrow?" "Hey, Earth to Jimmy. She needs help," John snapped. Finally, Jimmy dropped the armload of firewood he held and rushed to John's side. He wrapped his thick arms around the woman's waist and easily lifted her to his shoulders. "Seriously, though, how come I leave for 15 minutes, and then you're dragging a jungle lady back to the truck?" Jimmy asked as the two began walking back to the vehicle. The woman sprawled over Jimmy's shoulder like a rag doll. "I was chopping wood, and then she was just there, with an arrow in her shoulder, staring at me like I'm E.T. Next thing I knew, she was on the ground." Oh. He was never one to trouble himself over complicated matters. When they got to their truck, Jimmy slipped the woman's body into the passenger seat, leaving her doubled over so as not to aggravate the arrow wound, more than her precarious position already did. When he got her in safely, he started toward the driver's door before John interrupted him. "Oh no, I'll drive. You'll give her a concussion with the way you drive." Jimmy shrugged and hopped into the bed of the truck, and John climbed into the driver's seat. The diesel engine grumbled to life, and John carefully shifted into gear and slowly took off toward the small town of Lovell, Wyoming. There, they could take her to the county hospital and hope the best for her. Strangely, this didn't feel as stressful as he thought it would. In fact, it actually felt rather good to be her knight in shining armor, so to speak. Not that she looked like she needed a knight. As they drove, a million questions raced through John's mind. How would he explain what happened? What did happen? How could a costumed woman end up gravely injured in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness? His thoughts were little more than a jumble of adrenaline-fueled confusion and wonder. Whatever happened, John decided he would help this woman as much as he could. He knew Jimmy would tease him that it was because the woman was pretty, and though that was true, John felt a strong urge to uncover this mystery. If it really was as simple as a costumed woman getting lost in the woods, it would end there. But if not, well, John would have the adventure of his life on his hands. After getting to the hospital, John fumbled his way through explaining what had happened. He doubted anyone believed him, but with time, the woman would heal and be able to tell her story. A police officer came up to him after interviewing Jimmy and asked one final question. "Was there anything else in the area when you found her?" John reflexively placed his hand on the pocket that held the small metal object. The way she clutched it in her hand, something told him it was worth protecting. "I didn't see anything else at all." The next day, John went to the county hospital as soon as he got up. After some confusion at the nurse's station, where they hoped he would have a clue who she was or what language she spoke, John nervously strode down the hall to her room. A nurse stood outside, busily filling out a form on a clipboard. He walked up to her and said, "Hi, I'm hoping to visit this patient." The nurse scoffed, gave him a strange look, and said, "Honey, good luck if you're wanting to visit her. She don't speak a word of English and wasn't too happy about the needles we had to stick her with. She's asleep right now, but you can try and see if she'll cooperate with you when she wakes up." With that, the nurse left for her other duties. The mystery surrounding this woman only got deeper and deeper. He stepped inside the room to find her peacefully asleep. Not surprisingly, she was even more beautiful without the blood, dirt, and scraggly flora. Scratches still covered much of her face and arms, but they did not detract from her allure. Her hair was taken out of its braid and parted neatly over her shoulders. It was long and reached nearly to her waist. He stood there, not quite sure whether to sit or simply stand. He had finally decided to sit down when her eyes fluttered. He froze, his heart now pounding. Her eyelids parted slightly, weighed down by the effects of the drugs they had given her and her own fatigue. Slowly, they opened fully, and John could see the stunning gray eyes he vaguely remembered dreaming about in the few hours of sleep he had gotten during the night. She stared at him, expressionless, as though deciding on what to think of him. After a moment, a sad smile came across her face. "Donna," she said, her voice hoarse. John had never heard that word in his life, yet he had the strangest feeling that it was a word of gratitude, a simple yet meaningful thank you. He blinked. A slow smile crept across his face as well. "You're welcome," he said, embarrassed that she would not know what that meant. She smiled a little wider, and John thought that perhaps she did understand what he had meant. Weariness dragged her eyelids down again, and with a small smile still on her lips, she slipped back into unconsciousness. John's furrowed brow reflected the conflict he felt inside. A bump protruded from his pocket, and he took the mysterious object out once again. It was so small, but he found himself staring at it for far too long. Great things could be done with it. That thought caught him off guard. He blinked hard, shoved the object back into his pocket, and strode out of the hospital room.